1888, and by the end of 1889 the first residents were housed and village life was slowly starting to get up and running. Today, Port Sunlight appears to be suspended in time. Idyllic initially, the picture box utopian qualities of its village-scapes can, after a while, begin to feel claustrophobic and eerie. What it's easy to forget as one wanders around the streets is that for the first decades of its existence, Port Sunlight was effectively a building site. The village was built over a period of nearly 50 years, with changes and additions after that time. During these decades, Port Sunlight's buildings and spaces were developed and redeveloped in order to provide sufficient housing stock and social spaces for the village's increasing population. And those population figures are striking. By 1900, the village had 2,007 inhabitants. By 1903, that figure had risen to 2,580. And by 1907, it's reached 3,600. That's an increase of 1,600 bodies in 7 years on what is a fairly small piece of land. And it's possible to get an idea, very briefly, of the impact of the expansion's material impact on the village from the differences between these two plans of Port Sunlight. So the top one's 1904 and the bottom one's 1914. And you can just see the increase in building on that land, and most of those small blocks are representing houses built to inhabit the growing population. The scale of expansion at Port Sunlight during the village's early years is akin to that which has attracted much attention from scholars of the modern city. And of course, just as in Britain's sprawling metropolises, the impact was not just material. This scale of growth also resulted in the social dynamics of the village community being in a continual state of flux. Alongside this rapid growth, the village has also been a tourist site since the early 1890s. The crowds of visitors that flocked to the factory and the village included day trippers, organised group visits, journalists, and scholars and professionals with an interest in social progress, including all the delegates of a housing conference in 1907. By 1914, Port Sunlight's annual visitor figures had reached around 50,000. From its earliest days, Port Sunlight has been gazed at, and its residents have been positioned both as social experiments and as spectacle. In this paper, which has come out of the first stages of research into a wider project on theatre and industrial villages, I'm going to talk a little bit about Port Sunlight's theatrical infrastructures, its performance spaces, its dramatic societies, and its entertainment programming, in order to suggest some early thinking about how theatre might have worked within this very particular, rapidly expanding community. Guiding my material here is firstly an emerging sense that theatre functioned in multiple interconnected ways in the developing village of Port Sunlight. Sunlighters could perform in amateur shows, they could watch companies who came to perform in the village, and they also contributed to the cycle of village performances and traditions that cemented its identity. Secondly, this material has been shaped by the question of how this theatrical activity was integrally connected to William Hesketh Lever's new and widely lauded ideas about recreation, community, business and identity. So, Port Sunlight Village was primarily the brainchild of William Hesketh Lever. Sunlight might have nominally been run by the Lever brothers, but it's William Hesketh who was at the forefront of the publicity, the innovation and the management in relation to the Wirral site. For Lever, the construction and the ongoing management of Port Sunlight Village ticked multiple boxes. It was an opportunity to realise his very strong interest in architecture, to explore ideas about social relations and community in practice, and crucially, at the same time for him, it made sound business sense. Lever consistently refuted the idea that the village was in any way a philanthropic gift to his workpeople. This was business. When Raffles Davison published a pictorial study of Port Sunlight in 1916, his primary finding was that it is the very essence of the village that it is claimed to be a sound business enterprise. Yet, coupled with this requirement that the village must be financially efficient, it's important to recognise that the streets and the buildings of Port Sunlight were an ambitious and a progressive space in many ways. Lever was well known, for the improvements in working and factory conditions he instigated at Sunlight. Shorter hours, better ventilation, and medical care, to name but a few. And Port Sunlight was widely lauded for the health of its population, by Lever and by others. Recording its visit in April 1900, the Red Letter praised what they found to be a model town of clean-cuffed, collared and happy-faced people. And their findings were echoed across a range of other publications. Much of the praise that appeared in print was followed by descriptions of both the working practices established by Lever and of what we might see now as an early belief in the value of work-life balance. And it's this second element of Lever's Industrial Village project that's of more direct significance to my paper today. Lever was convinced of the importance of what he described as the opportunity of reasonable and proper recreation and relief from toil. Leisure, he believed, improved both productivity and morale. The business case for this was recognised at the time. Raffles Davison stated it simply in the words that the well-being and comfort of Port Sunlight's workpeople is a valuable business asset. Lever also talked about it publicly a lot. In a speech to 200 members of the Girls' Institute in the village in October 1899, he focused on the need and the responsibility for what he called direct self-preservation in his employees. And what he meant by this was that they should take responsibility for their health and self. And enjoying themselves and taking an interest in life, he said, was central to this. So perhaps unsurprisingly, with Lever's views widely circulated in the press and regularly presented in person to villagers at village events, Port Sunlight had many recreational societies. In November 1900, the Sunlight Journal, Progress, noted that it may not be generally known, but nevertheless is fact, that in Port Sunlight there are more societies and clubs for social work and for mutual benefit than in any other village in the world. Alongside the praise it attracted, this activity also prompted questions and criticisms. Was this more social control than recreation and relief? And the presence of these critiques, I think, is clear in many of Lever's speeches and the way he sort of responds to these when he's talking to the villagers. And there's one delivered at the Village Flower Show in 1900 where he stands in front of an enormous crowd from the village and he talks to them and he rejects the label model village for their home and he tells them why, and he says that it indicates an attempt to control people's lives that he has no plans for in his village. He says, I want it to be understood that there is no attempt to interfere with the daily lives of the people and that all the social institutions at Port Sunlight are promoted and carried out by the people themselves and the directors have nothing whatever to do with them, except to see that no impediment is put in their way. So, theatre at Port Sunlight found itself functioning amidst a world in which recreation was a practical requirement, a business strategy, a subject of social commentary, and of academic inquiry. And theatre as recreation in this context, or the set of contexts, positions it as part of an active agenda to improve the health and the quality of life. It's a really unusual place for theatre in the early 20th century. So Port Sunlight Dramatic Society was established in May 1894. It's one of the very earliest of the village societies to be formed. And its home was the Gladstone Hall, which is right next to Port Sunlight train station if you do go to the village. The Gladstone Hall opened in 1891, and it was licensed for music, dancing and plays from its very earliest moments. Lever was pleased with the building. He explained that the aim had been to provide a simple, unpretentious space, admirably adapted for the purpose for which it was designed. Perhaps here he should have said purposes. For this first venue began Lever's project of supplying the village with a series of multifunctional recreational spaces. During the working week, Gladstone Hall's primary function was to serve as the men's dining halls of the factory. And it provided spaces for hundreds of workers to come along and they could eat their lunch they bought from home, or there were also facilities to heat and eat a lunch that you bought from home. On weekday evenings, it was heavily booked for other activities, and on Sundays, there was a regular booking for the Sunday service. A quick look at a table of bookings for January 1895 offers a snapshot for the demand for this space. On Monday evening, the Dramatic Society rehearsed. On Tuesdays, the village's resident minstrel troupe. On Wednesday, the choir. Thursdays were used for entertainments that were programmed by the Village Council's entertainments wing, and that included shows put on by the Dramatic Society, as well as by professional performers and companies who were booked in. On Friday, the popular village chemistry class took place in the Gladstone Hall, and on Sunday, the Sunday services, which were far more akin to lectures than church services, and were often included magic lantern lectures and magic lantern showmen. The Dramatic Society's repertoire in the early years, and in the period covered here, was tinged with nostalgia, and reveals a fondness for the popular and well-respected late Victorian playwright Auguste Wynne-Pinero, for Gilbert and Sullivan, for social comedies and for melodramas. And I thought it might be useful just to have a quick look at some of the productions and to give some brief information about who was involved. So, in February 1903, the Port Sunlight Dramatic Society staged The Magistrate, a three-act farce by Pinero. It was well received by the audience, according to the Port Sunlight Journal. It was admirably staged, the review recorded. And attention was paid to production value. We know that scenery, stage fittings, effects, wigs and furniture were all hired in from external suppliers. The parts were well sustained throughout, continued the reviewer, and gave evidence of perfect training and frequent rehearsals. Now, anyone who has ever rehearsed for an amateur or professional show will know that this was a lot of effort for one public performance. Were the processes of meeting, activity and rehearsal more important perhaps in the grand scheme of village life than the public outcome? Or was the Gladstone Hall so heavily booked routinely that a one-night production was all that was feasible? Or did they perhaps think there was only a sufficient audience for one night? These are all questions I still need to answer, but that one-night performance seems significant. Amongst those on stage during The Magistrate was Miss Edith Kenyon, playing B.T. Tomlinson. Kenyon was 21 years old, and she was a clerk at the Sunlight Factory. She lived just outside the village boundary. She's that top left dot there, across the railway line. As Agatha Poskett was Miss Margaret Bradshaw. She was 24, and she was a teacher at the village school. She lived at 88 Greendale Road, in the heart of the village, in the village post office. It's now the tea rooms. Her mother, widowed young, was the postmistress. During the following month, the Society staged another Pinero, the comedy suite Lavender. This was a restaging of a successful production from the previous year, perhaps reflecting the amount of labour and resource that went into a one-night show and the desirability of finding another public outlet for it. Margaret Bradshaw was in the cast again, alongside Kathleen Pritchard, 21 years old, and clerk at the factory, Alfred Gregory, also 21, and also a clerk at the factory, and Walter Lockhart, who was 19, and also, unsurprisingly, a clerk at the factory. So Bradshaw, Pritchard and Gregory all live on Greendale Road, and Lockhart lives on Bridge Street, which is there, and that's his house. The production again was well received, with praise directed at the energy and the commitment given by the performers. So time limitations mean that I cannot give you many examples of the plays produced and the individuals who performed. But what I can offer at this point as an overview is that the casts were dominated by low-level managerial staff and clerks from the factory, that the society was made up of roughly equal numbers of young men and young women, which is unusual in this period, and across the first 3 decades of its history, it was unusual for members to be older than 30. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Dramatic Society's history is also peppered with tales of friction and creative difference. Secretaries and other members of the Society resign, rehearsals come to a shrieking halt mid-production, budgets are not submitted, and the Society itself was formed, reformed and renamed, often with an entire change in membership on a reasonably regular basis. Let's come back to the Gladstone Hall. So it was clear that the activities that could take place in the Gladstone Hall greatly exceeded its capacity, and a series of other public spaces swiftly materialised following the opening of the hall in 1891. There's a list of them here on this slide. All of them were built and active by 1903. These public spaces became an influential characteristic of Port Sunlight, and when you look at writings from people interested in the early Garden City movement, it's the public space and the public buildings, the sort of activity and recreation that was being encouraged that takes the front page a lot of the time. Amongst the new spaces was the Hume Hall, opened in 1901. The hall served as the women's dining hall during the day and was used for functions and meetings in the evenings and on the weekend. It could seat 1,500 in dining hall layout, so it's likely its capacity was a couple of hundred higher than that when it was in entertainment format. I can't find the figures, but if you remove the tables and look at the same sort of algorithm that you would get from the Gladstone with and without tables, I would suggest it's somewhere around 1,100. The schools and the Girls' Institute also had spaces that were used for performance with stages. And like the Gladstone Hall, all of these spaces were very familiar from day-to-day village life. They served many different functions and they were familiar in all sorts of different ways to Port Sunlighters. Performances in them were an extension of villagers' work and their social and leisure experiences. So the theatre that took place in them, I'm suggesting here, was spatially embedded in Port Sunlight life. But then, in 1902, came an announcement about an entertainment and recreation bill that was very different and ambitious, even on the Lever scale. We are erecting an open-air theatre, which for want of a better name will be called the Auditorium, Lever announced in the British Architect. The sloping banks of the ravine allow of a perfect arrangement of seats, somewhat on the lines of the classical Greek theatres. Of course, I know it is somewhat risky to build an open-air theatre in this uncertain climate, but the view taken is this, that we may possibly rely on 4 months each year, during which we shall find the theatre extremely useful. The floor space of the auditorium was 80 foot long and 40 foot broad. Like each of the public space builds before it, it was multifunctional. It had a well-equipped raised stage, a parquet floor for dances, good sightlines, a seating capacity of, people argue, anywhere between 2,500 and 3,200, a green room, prop and scene store, and dressing rooms for actors and actresses. The scene store was stocked with backdrops of village streets, and it was common that these would be used by travelling companies when they came in to perform in the auditorium. It was much cheaper to travel without set than it was to travel with set. Most of those scenic drops appear to have been representations of Port Sunlight Village. So when you went into the auditorium, you saw the play against the backdrop of what you would see outside. The auditorium was never really open air. Lever's ideas about the weather did come back to haunt him. The first season was blighted by torrential rain for about a month, and the occasional used canvas roof, which you can see here in place, was eventually replaced by a permanent slate tiled roof in 1906. It appears to have been on the canvas roof for the entire first season. I would imagine that had as much to do with the logistics of getting it on and off as it did with anything else, because the thought of removing that in between productions is slightly daunting. What's interesting about the auditorium is that unlike other accounts of the public spaces in the village, the auditorium appears to have been an unpopular proposition. On the 3rd of April 1903, while the space was still under construction, and the site of the auditorium is in the heart of the village, so that iconic image of sunlight I showed you at the beginning with the bridge and the Lyceum, the school tower behind it, it was in the dell behind that bridge, so it's right in the heart of village life, this massive building site. So on the 3rd of April 1903, while it's still under construction, Lever gives a speech to the gymnastics at the gymnastics club display in Hume Hall. He went to almost everything, and he gave a speech at almost everything. Every time one of the recreational societies put on a performance, he was there. He would finish by taking thanks and then giving a speech. He'd been irritated by an article in the World's Work by a journalist who'd visited Port Sunlight and had sweepingly declared every single one of the village's institutions and societies to be a failure. This he soundly rejected, and he offered the auditorium as another example of why the village community and its leisure activities were thriving. And he starts talking to the villagers as part of this. He sort of moves on from responding to the article and says, you know, it's the first time such a thing's been attempted in England. And he did not wish anyone to go to the auditorium unless they could enjoy themselves. But he did ask them to give it a trial. And this statement to me, in the context of his other speeches, seems to bear a tone of defensiveness, a sense that there's something more going on here than a newspaper article in the World's Work. Perhaps there's a little sense in the village that this build is out of sync, out of step, too big. What are we going to do with it? After a high-profile opening ceremony, The Auditorium's first season was launched by the Avenue Hero Company in mid-June 1903. And they appeared for 2 nights a week for 4 weeks, so they have a month booking. They do okay, audiences aren't capacity, but it's breaking even. They were followed by Mr. Haldane Crichton's company, who came in with a comic opera called The Dandy Fifth. And then we have a programme of entertainment that continues across the summer and into the following years. For example, the following year, Harold Nielsen's company come down from London. He's a big touring provincial company at this time. And their key piece is a play called A Bunch of Violets, which is a huge West End hit from the 1890s. So this idea of kind of nostalgic theatre is still important even when they're trying to programme the auditorium. Across the next 3 decades, the auditorium was used for flower shows, drill displays, roller skating balls, tea parties, cakewalk competitions, children's services, bicycle displays, gymnastic spectacles and snow carnivals. It also served as a rallying point. When Lever finally gets into Parliament, I think it's his 5th attempt in January 1906, it's the auditorium that supplies a site for its celebratory marking of that event. And the accounts of it suggest this almost happened spontaneously in the way that wonderful media accounts do, that everyone at the factory downed tools, and they all kind of made their way to the auditorium, and the band got themselves together, they kind of rushed home, got their instruments and kind of started playing on the way to the auditorium, and they wait there for Lever to return for an extended period of time, and then he addresses the village community. So this is a hybrid space. It hosted the politics, the recreation, the spectacle, the religion and the business of the Port Sunlight world. But by 1909, the travelling companies booked to appear at the venue had dropped off. Now, according to W.L. George, who wrote a book on Port Sunlight, was published in 1909, they visit just from time to time. Certainly less often than they did in the early years. The auditorium was, the author concluded, not extensively patronised by the villagers. And perhaps unlike the Gladstone Hall, the auditorium was out of sync with village life. It didn't fit into the recreational practices that some artists were doing on a day-to-day basis. There aren't the connections that there are with these other buildings. It became very much an occasional space, rather than a space that was embedded in the village. Lever was right, it seems, to feel a little defensive about it. The auditorium was finally demolished in 1937. There's some staggering images of them taking down the Pontown structure. And according to oral histories in the village, it wasn't the scale, the size or the entertainment that finally did for the venue, it was the rats. Because it's in a dell and they just couldn't control the vermin at the end of the day, and that's where it went. Now, this is the first time I've presented research at this stage for some years, and I've struggled with the ending of this paper. It's had about 6 today. Those who saw me last night will know that the last one happened on a napkin. But I think the thing is, and what I've accepted is that there is no end to this paper at this point. It's a series of beginnings. And so I think the most helpful way to pull this all together is to offer some concluding thoughts and an indication of where this is going to go next. So my first is that theatrical performance at Port Sunlight is interesting and unusual because it's a respected part of social life, because it straddles a commercial and an amateur entertainment, because it straddles professional and amateur entertainment, because it's made in-house and bought in, but even when it's bought in, it's often performed against an image of Port Sunlight. And this, for me, makes it a particular case study. I'm really interested in the local as well, and coming back to these backdrops, they've become the kind of centre point, a focal point for me in this, in the idea that there's something to do with sunlight life and community being expressed and articulated, not only through the work of the dramatic societies, but through the spaces that are made, and the audiences and spectators' engagement with those spaces. And that perhaps when you lose the local in the way that perhaps happened in that auditorium, that's when it's no longer effective. That's when that dynamic of engagement between industry, performer and audience ceases to work, ceases to function. And finally, that these backdrops hang behind all sorts of things in the auditorium. So this is a Sunday School anniversary service from 1907. And you can see again the kind of the directors of the company, and this is there's Lever, and this is Reverend S. Gamble Walker. And they're sitting there leading the service, and then the children do a little show. They do a little excerpt from one of the Bible stories for them. At the time, the image behind are those Port Sunlight streets. And those streets have been seen behind gymnastics displays, between drill displays, between flower shows, behind Hero companies. And I think what I'd like to finish with is that theatre functioned as part of a much wider web of recreational activities at Port Sunlight. And that, to me, at this point, it doesn't make sense to consider it without considering the other kind of performances that are going on. And the next step of research is to wade through images of fancy dress parades, the parades of children leaving to go to Thornton Hough, where Lever lived, at Thornton Manor for their annual Sunday school tea parties, where they were entertained on the lawn and in the conservatories, and Mrs. Lever bought them cake and they all got a book and some sweets at the end. And then they came back. But those coaches left the village. It took them 2 hours to get there because they went so slowly, because they were being processed through every passing space that was possible, led by the village band. There are carnivals on an annual basis. The schools are running events. The Staff Training College, when it's established in the second decade of the 20th century, brings drama into its education programme. Now, in that Staff Training College, Lever was offering lessons to his staff aged between 17 and 25. It's a crucial age for him to really engineer his managers of the future, and his drama and education being used in a really example, really positive case. So that's where I'm going next. I'm going outside of the dramatic societies, off the stage for a little while, onto the streets of Port Sunlight, into its spaces, onto its dance floors, and onto the streets on the way to Thornton Hough and Thornton Manor, to try and trace or extend out this set of images and ideas that have been established through the dramatic society, through entertainment programmes at Sunlight. And that's it.